The cemetery caretaker stopped me before I reached the grave. "Sir, you're looking for the wrong person." I laughed nervously and showed him the name written on my phone. He stared at it for a few seconds, then pointed toward an old headstone hidden beneath the trees. "You need to see this one first." I followed him, confused. The name carved into that stone was one I had never heard before. But underneath it was my family surname. I had gone there to bury the last questions I had about my father, who had died 6 months earlier. My whole life, I believed I knew our family history. My father had always told me my mother was his only wife and that I was his only child. But that afternoon, standing beside that forgotten grave, I began to wonder if everything he told me had been a lie. If stories about family secrets and betrayals keep you watching, subscribe to Family Betrayal, because what I discovered that day changed the way I saw every person I loved. And just so you know, the faces, photographs, backgrounds, and scenes shown in this video are visual representations created only to help imagine the story. The caretaker brushed dirt from the old stone and whispered, "Your father used to come here every year." My heart dropped. My father had never mentioned this place. Then I saw the date beneath the stranger's name. It was 40 years old. I asked the caretaker who the man was. He looked at me with an expression I will never forget. "He wasn't a man," he said. "It was a woman." My stomach tightened. Her name was Sarah. And beside her name were the words that made my entire childhood suddenly feel like a carefully constructed lie. I stood there staring at Sarah's name until the letters seemed to blur. The caretaker told me she had died 40 years earlier, shortly before my father married my mother. He said my father had visited her grave every year, sometimes carrying flowers, sometimes sitting alone for hours. I couldn't understand it. My father had never spoken her name. Not once. Then the caretaker reached into an old wooden office cabinet and pulled out a faded visitor book. He turned to a page from decades ago. My father's handwriting was there. Under Sarah's name, he had written one sentence, "I'm sorry I couldn't protect you." I felt anger rise in my chest. Why would my father write that? Who was Sarah? And what had he failed to protect her from? I drove home with the visitor book copied into my phone. I wanted to confront my mother, but when I walked through the door, she took one look at my face and immediately knew something was wrong. I said, "Mom, who is Sarah?" The color disappeared from her face. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she quietly said, "Where did you hear that name?" That question scared me more than any answer could have. I told her about the cemetery. She sat down and covered her face with both hands. Finally, she looked at me and said, "Your father wanted you to believe Sarah never existed." I felt my heart pounding. Why? My mother began crying. "She was your father's first wife." I couldn't breathe. My father had been married before my mother. But that still wasn't the worst part. My mother looked directly at me and whispered, "And she had a son." A son. I suddenly understood why my father had been so secretive about our family. But I had no idea that his son was still alive. And somehow, he already knew my name. That night, my mother finally told me everything she had kept hidden for 40 years. Sarah had married my father when they were very young. They had a son named Daniel. But their marriage ended badly, and Sarah became seriously ill. My father left, claiming he could not handle the situation. According to my mother, Sarah begged him to stay for Daniel. He didn't. Instead, he eventually married my mother. I was born a few years later. But Daniel never disappeared. He grew up believing my father had abandoned him because he didn't want him. My father continued sending money secretly, but he refused to meet him. My mother said my father was ashamed and afraid that the truth would destroy our family. I asked her why she had stayed silent. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. "Because your father made me promise." I spent that night furious. Not only at my father, but at my mother for protecting his secret. Then my phone rang. The number was unknown. I answered. A man said, "You found Sarah's grave." I froze. "Who is this?" "My name is Daniel." I couldn't speak. He continued, "I've been waiting years for you to find me." I asked how he got my number. He said my father had left him a letter before he died. Then he said something that completely changed everything. "Your father didn't abandon me because he hated me. He abandoned me because Sarah made him promise something." "What promise?" Daniel went silent. Then he said, "He promised to keep you safe from someone in our family." My blood ran cold. I asked him who. He refused to answer over the phone. Instead, he told me to meet him at the cemetery the next morning. I barely slept. The next day, I stood beside Sarah's grave waiting for the brother I never knew existed. When Daniel finally arrived, he looked at me for several seconds. Then he handed me an old envelope. My mother told me to give this to you if you ever came looking. My hands shook as I opened it. The first line read, "My son, if you're reading this, the truth has finally found you." And the next sentence made me question whether my father had actually been the villain in this story. The letter explained everything. Sarah had discovered that someone in the family was secretly stealing money from my father's business. When she confronted him, she was threatened. My father tried to protect her, but the person responsible warned him that if he exposed the truth, Daniel and I would both suffer. My father chose silence. But silence destroyed Sarah anyway. She died believing my father had abandoned her, while my father spent the rest of his life carrying the guilt. The person behind everything was my father's older brother, the man I had grown up calling Uncle Robert. I remembered how Robert had always treated my father like he owed him something. After my father died, Robert had immediately asked about the estate. At the time, I thought he was simply being greedy. Now I understood. Daniel showed me another document. It proved Robert had been taking money from the family business for years. My father had discovered it shortly before Sarah died. But there was one final surprise. My father had secretly kept evidence all those years. He had placed everything inside a safety deposit box and left instructions that Daniel and I should receive it together. For 40 years, my father had been waiting for the truth to survive him. Daniel and I confronted Robert with the documents. He denied everything at first. Then we showed him the signatures, bank records, and my father's letters. His face changed. He finally admitted what he had done. I expected to feel victory. Instead, I felt exhausted. I thought about my father, my mother, Sarah, and Daniel. 4 decades of pain caused by secrets that had protected nobody. Daniel and I eventually stood together at Sarah's grave. For the first time, I wasn't standing there as a stranger. I was standing beside my brother. I realized something that day: family isn't always the people who share your childhood. Sometimes family is the person who carries the same wounds and still chooses to forgive. I never got the chance to ask my father why he waited so long. But I finally understood why he kept returning to that grave. He wasn't visiting a secret. He was visiting the life he wished he could have saved. If you were in my place, would you have forgiven your father, confronted Robert, or walked away from all of them? Tell me what you would have done in the comments. And if this story made you think about the secrets families carry, share it with someone you care about. Sometimes one honest conversation can prevent years of regret. Subscribe to Family Betrayal for more stories where the truth may stay buried for years, but it never stays buried forever. The greatest inheritance my father left me wasn't money or property. It was the truth, and the chance to finally call my brother family.